the world of the 16th century that Ignatius lived in was undergoing a great deal of change. There had been technological developments in the 15th century that allowed for greater navigation of waters, the discovery of the New World, exploration all over the world by European powers. There was a shift economically from the Mediterranean as a center of trade to the Atlantic and North Atlantic particularly, that changed the wealth of Europe, shifted the wealth of Europe to the West. And all of this may or may not have been completely appreciated by a Basque nobleman in Spain. But what was happening was a controversy of ideas as well. The fact that the printing press had developed at the end of the 15th century, and that there was the chance to communicate and transmit ideas at a speed that had never been known. Books could be printed in the hundreds in a very short period of time instead of copied one by one over years. All of those technological changes were having an impact on the world in which Ignatius lived. And he was to some extent aware of it, and to some extent still trying to live and work in the traditions of the past. Most people, when they think of Reformation in the church, think of Martin Luther in 1517, which is part of the answer, part of the truth. What people fail to realize is that there was a reformation of the church that began well before Luther, and there were reformations within the Catholic Church well after Luther. And so there's a wide range of ways of reforming the church, the Christian church, that again is centered in the 16th century. So what were the different kinds of Reformation? Before Luther, there was the movements, the spiritual movements in the north of Europe, especially in the Low Countries, for a spirituality that was much more based on personal piety, on personal conversion. This would have an influence on Ignatius and the spiritual exercises, that there is a responsibility for living one's life in a just way and in a way that follows the way of Jesus Christ. There was a humanist reformation that took place in Renaissance Italy, of returning to the sources, in the case of the church, to the early writers of the patristic era, what was important for the formation of the church in the period after the apostolic age. There was a sense of regaining that sense of the simplicity of the early church. That in some ways will have an influence on Luther and the more radical reformers who want to go back to the way it was in the early days, or at least the way they thought it was. Then you have a sort of conservative reform movement that is centered in Spain, and again would have its influence on Saint Ignatius, of reforming the church, within the Catholic Church, and doing it by helping, by enforcing rules that would eliminate abuses by the clergy, especially in the church. One of the best examples of that is the fact that Ignatius of Loyola, long before his conversion, was given minor orders. Why? So that he could hold the property of the church in his native land. He used the fact that he had minor orders to claim exemption from civil law when he was arrested for assault. It didn't work because the king had already begun to reform the church by saying, if you didn't dress like a priest or a cleric, you couldn't claim to be one. This reform that is very conservative in the sense that it keeps the rules, conserves the rules, and brings good practice, is almost completely unknown, but has a great influence on Ignatius. I think Ignatius is influenced by that, by the humanism of the Italian Renaissance, by the spirituality of the northern countries, and then by the life of the early clerks regular, the Theatines, Samoskins, Barnabites, who all decided that the best way to reform the clergy was by creating communities of priests who lived their lives with integrity, with honesty, without avarice. All of those things that we see in the constitutions of the Jesuits are very important. The gratuity of ministries, the simplicity that at least the early Jesuits sought in terms of decorations and music. It gradually disappears in the art of the Baroque, but at least initially there was a sense of having a simple elegance that would show a Reformed church. One of the interesting pieces of hagiography about Ignatius was a theory that was proposed initially by the early Jesuits, that Ignatius's injury at Pamplona and his conversion, subsequent conversion, was a response by God to the Lutheran Reformation that had begun only a few short years before. As a result of this hagiography, the Jesuits gradually came to be seen as counter-Reformation, as people opposed to any kind of reform of the church, when in fact the Jesuits simply represented a different kind of reform of the church. And what's very interesting is the early Jesuits who encountered Lutherans in the various parts of the empire came to realize that the best way to unify the church would be to reform the clergy and to educate the clergy, which is the beginning of the move towards Jesuit education. Because in a sense, if we want unity in the church, there has to be good practice. There has to be good theology. The problem with that is that gradually the Jesuit schools came to be seen as places where Lutheran theology was challenged or refuted, and it became once again an instrument of counter-Reformation, rather as what it was intended to be, a Reformation that reunified a divided church.